So first of all, Boris Johnson's speech today was, I think it's fair to say, light on policy detail. It was also pretty light on references to climate change. Now, compare that to his speech to the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, which he dedicated entirely to the need for action on climate change. And as the host of the huge COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, coming up in only a few weeks, what does this say about his leadership and how should leaders approach climate action? So, Maryam, to you first of all. So there was little reference to it in his conference speech, but we did hear from the Prime Minister this week making a new pledge to turn the power grid green by 2035. The latest, some would say, in a line of quite ambitious climate targets. So is that what good climate leadership looks like?
I do think that the time for pledges and commitments is kind of coming to an end. I think people will need action. I think we need to know how we're going to get there and what it's going to mean for every single person that lives in this country. And I think pledges are a great place to start, but it seems that if we end there, we're never going to be able to take the steps we need to take to address this climate crisis.
Would you agree with that, Jerome, that targets are all very well, but you have to spell out to the public, to businesses, perhaps to fellow politicians that you need to get on side as well, what it means to reach those targets? And do you think that, as an advisor to Joe Biden, do you think he's doing any better on that front?
Absolutely. I think that when we talk about the differences between the UK and the US right now, the US has a whole of government approach. And we talk about it from an electric vehicle standpoint, from a job standpoint, and from an overall solution standpoint. And we have the details. And I think that's what was really encouraging about the US is that we are working towards that and we are seeing tangible results.
But Joe Biden has a fight on his hand to convince everybody in government, hasn't he, to come on side with some of the plans. It's not all straightforward there. Jerome?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, we're seeing a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, which, if passed, would accomplish many of this administration's goals. And that's really a challenge right now. Over the next week or so, we're working to convince other elected officials that this is an urgent priority and has to be tackled with the details at the forefront.
Well, yes, and finance is really important, isn't it, Maryam? Not just in convincing fellow politicians. There are different departments within government that are all vying for money in a post-COVID era, but also you've got to convince the public as well, who might worry that it's going to cost them more, these plans to go green. That takes leadership, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's also about really showing all of us here in the UK that actually by reaching our green targets, by making those pledges and actually attaining them, that we're actually going to be able to live up to some of the targets that people want in their own lives when it comes to jobs and health. Like the environmental targets we set also let us achieve other things that people do already care about. So it's not just about diverting everything to the environment, but looking at how all these things intersect.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned jobs, actually, because, Jerome, I'm just going to point out what Joe Biden has said about jobs and the green economy. He said it's going to create millions of jobs. I think it's a gigantic opportunity to create really good jobs. And clearly, Joe Biden's strategy is trying to frame this as a kind of positive economic step. But is that cutting through? People are worried there, aren't they, about jobs in fossil fuel industries going. And the country's really quite divided on the climate question, isn't it?
I think that it actually is very straightforward when we talk about jobs. It's when we talk about workforce development, we transition people who are working in fossil fuels to now install solar panels and wind turbines. It's a jobs perspective at the very forefront. Every solution will create millions of good paying jobs. And the biggest thing that we're working on right now is called the Civilian Climate Corps, which would mobilize millions of young Americans to be able to work directly in the solutions that will save us. When we talk about the cost of solutions, we have to talk about also the cost of not implementing them. The cost of natural disasters devastating communities is far higher than the solutions that are needed that also will have a positive job impact as well.
OK, and interesting to see if that does bring people on side.